And now we come anyway to our favourite topic, the Cass Review, which is really just the latest front in this exhausting culture war. It's a long and complex document. It's nearly 400 pages long. I can't analyse it in full here. But of course, it's worth noting that having gone from protecting women, the next big thing that always wins you your case if you're on the far right is, oh, well, now we can protect the kids. So it's all about the kids. It's all about women and kids, isn't it? Nobody is ever anti-trans. They're just protecting women and kids. And we should not be surprised at the result of the Cass Review. By the way, this is the government, the Tory government, that commissioned the Sewell report into racism in Britain, which came back saying there was no racism in Britain. So if you can have a report into racism which says there's no racism, it's hardly surprising you have a report on trans kids, which comes back effectively saying there's no such thing as trans kids. So on the one hand, you have Hilary Cass, who comes across as a mild-mannered, I don't know if you've seen her interview, she comes across as a mild-mannered, reasonable-sounding woman, lots of weasel words about caring for trans kids, providing a high-quality, holistic care service. But she's produced a deeply flawed anti-trans report, and that becomes very clear once it's closely examined. And look at the people involved in it. And by the way, she has no experience of trans healthcare at all, no experience at all of working in this field. And she was actually selected for that purpose. On the other hand, you get the reasonable, the good cop, Hilary Cass. Then you get the bad cop, where you get GB News and Talk Radio, I think, Talk TV, unleashing a right-wing media baying like hounds, using Cass to triumphantly call for an end to trans healthcare for young people in total. The only gender clinic in England was closed, and the replacements to it have been completely inadequate. And for now, at the moment, there's effectively a virtual ban on medical interventions for young trans people, for under 18s. And you can see, if you look at the Cass report, from its very early planning stages, there was a bias. There were no trans professionals or researchers were involved in drawing up the report or assessing the research. They explicitly, deliberately excluded trans people from this exercise of assessing the evidence, because, you see, trans people are biased. But on the other hand, it does involve professionals who were explicitly skeptical or hostile to young people medically transitioning before, who had an expressed opinion of being against trans people transitioning before the study was set up. The person who was in charge of the main survey of trans young people, this sort of the systematic review of all the kind of available evidence, was a woman called Tilly Langdon from York University. And she had resigned from the previous Tavistock gender clinic, which was the only clinic in the country. She had previously resigned in protest at their use of affirmative care. She explicitly thought that you shouldn't be affirmative to trans kids, and you should try and, if you possibly can, somehow delay, wait and see if they change their mind. Equally, a woman explicitly involved in the Cass Review at a high level was a woman called Rita Kaltiala from Finland, who's already set up a system along the lines of Cass wanted in Finland. And she and others have been involved with a guy called Patrick Stewart, I think his name is, who is based in Florida, and who's been working with Ron DeSantis, who's basically trying to, virtually banned trans healthcare in Florida. So you can see the links to the different anti-trans campaigns of all the people heavily involved and people that Cass brought in. She was ignorant, if you like, and she's brought in explicitly anti-trans people to help. Instead of affirmative therapy, they go about exploratory therapy. And this is a euphemism. If you see exploratory therapy, again, like, oh, biological sex, it looks very reasonable. But it isn't. It's a euphemism for seeing a trans outcome as inherently bad. So all kinds of therapies and drugs for depression, you can do all kinds of different psychotherapies, but what you can't do is look at transition itself. So if you present to this service and you're trans and you're depressed and you're anxious, well, why wouldn't you be, by the way, if you grew up trans in this country? But there's, oh no, the problem isn't being trans. The problem is your depression, is your anxiety. If you're autistic, we'll deal with the autism first. They deal with all those different problems instead of dealing with your gender problems. Not as well as, because you'd have to be crazy not to say that those issues should be dealt with as well as your gender difficulties, your gender dysphoria. But they want to deal with all of those issues as if we deal with those issues, perhaps this person might not be trans after all. So instead of dealing with the holistic whole child, as it were, alongside it, their gender transition, they do it instead of. And they really hope, let's face it, they hope it'll all go away. They see trans amongst children largely as a result of social contagion. They see it as a fad. And there's no evidence, let's be clear, there's no reliable evidence from any reputable survey or research which backs that up. There was indeed a steep increase in referrals, not actual transitions, but just people referred to a gender clinic. Between 2015 and 2018, there was an enormous, very, very steep increase, very, very steep increase. And that was because knowledge and acceptance of trans people had greatly increased in that period because of the reforms I talked about before. But what they don't show, and when Cass Cass actually included the line chart in her report, but she cuts off before those figures actually leveled off. They leveled off and dipped. So she keeps the sudden increase, but she lies about the dip. So there's no longer going up in such terms. Cass is very concerned all through the report with why people turn out to be trans. And the implication of all this is, if we find out why people end up being trans, we can do something to stop it. And that's clearly, that thread runs through the entire report. For Cass, a child turning out trans in the end is seen as a failure. She's keen, very keen, because she realizes the reputational damage. She's very keen not to be labeled a conversion therapist. And of course, she's not suggesting electric shocks or exorcism or praying the gay away, whatever. But she has put her name to a pathway designed to prevent kids turning out trans, ideally. And even if they fail and the kid turns out to be trans and becomes a really happy trans adult, she explicitly says in the report, we can't count that as a success because that person would not know what they're missing. They're not know how happy they would have been had they not been trans. That even a happy trans person is not a success because they might have been even happier had they not been trans. So, no way of being trans is a success for Cass. In the report, she designed a particular system to assess the studies that she looked at and the evidence. And guess what? Can you guess? Under the system she designed to assess the evidence, she found that the evidence of the benefits of puberty blockers and social transition to be very poor. On the way to this, she managed to exclude the largest ever survey carried out of trans people by Jack Turbin in the USA, which looked at over 21,000 trans people. She disregarded that completely. And she decided that looking at all these social surveys, basically that most of them were poor, and therefore she disregarded them. But you have to realize when you're looking at these kind of surveys of research, poor does not mean useless. This is the difference really between academic use of language and the layperson's understanding of poor quality. It's quite normal in academia to have lower quality surveys, which are not disregarded. They're marked as low quality. But if you put them all together, if survey after survey after survey in very large numbers comes up with the same results, then they are considered collectively valuable. They all add up to a body of evidence. Lots of other medical treatments rely upon these kind of mix of such studies. So she disregarded the low quality studies. She looked at the moderate studies, which are about less than half of them, but didn't use them to actually inform her conclusions. And what she did say was that she would have preferred to see more blind trials. Now, blind trials are where you give, a medication to a person, and then but to another person in the same situation, you don't give the medication. You give a placebo. Now, if you're talking about puberty blockers, so you have two kids, one kid you give puberty blockers to, and the other one you give a lump of sugar. The lump of sugar kid is going to work out pretty quickly that puberty is starting and that they've got the placebo. So it's a complete nonsense. It's unethical to do it, and it's a nonsense. It cannot work. And even Cass herself recognizes that it's difficult to do and almost impossible to do. But she says but because we've got no trials of that all of the evidence is low quality. So, she says the evidence is low quality, but the high quality studies are impossible. So you see how the words she uses have been twisted by the press to make it look as if the qualities are all really bad, and that the evidence for the beneficial use of puberty blockers is very weak. The truth is, there's overwhelming evidence of the benefits of puberty blockers, which have been safely used for decades and are reversible. But Cass ignored it and recommended only using puberty blockers as part of a limited compulsory research project. Now we're back to unethical again, because basically now she's making if in order to receive puberty blockers, you now have to agree to being part of research projects. So it's conditional upon agreeing to be part of the research. I can't think of any other medical field where that would be the case, where if you don't agree to be part of the research, you don't get the treatment. And the Cass UK approach now is an outlier, apart from Finland and Sweden, which I mentioned before, and some red states, some Republican states in the USA. It's completely out of step with the world consensus. Let's be clear, there is no evidence that social transition for children, which is just change of name, hairstyle, clothes, and so on, there's no evidence that social transition or the use of puberty blockers cause actual harm, beyond, of course, some side effects of puberty blockers, which can be managed and monitored as many medicines are. All Cass says is that there's not enough evidence that the puberty blockers of social transitioning is good. But even Cass can't come up with any evidence that there's harmful. But the only harm you see under Cass's worldview is turning out trans at all. That basically, if you turn out trans, that in itself is a harm. So anything you can do to stop that is a good thing. So Cass demands a very high standard of evidence for medical interventions, but produces no evidence of the benefits of not medically intervening. But you see, doing nothing is an intervention. What you're doing is denying care to trans young people and leaving them to experience a puberty which they find massively distressing, and in some cases can lead to self-harm or to suicide, and which can actually have a negative effect on the rest of their life, truthfully. Cass complains that 98% of those who took puberty blockers went on to become trans. Well, what do you know? Only 27% were even referred for blockers. And of those 27%, only half actually got them. So the people who get puberty blockers are the clearest and most desperate cases of people who really need to stop puberty because of the levels of distress it's causing. And what do you know? 98% of them went on to transition. Well, who would have guessed? But now, where we are. At the moment, there are now no new prescriptions for puberty blockers in England and Wales, and under pressure, Scotland did the same. And now they're also trying to ban private clinics from prescribing, so that kids and their parents can't go to private clinics to get the same medicine. So now the only place left now is the dark web. You know, the only place that the teenage can go is by getting the medicine online to the dark web. And I don't need to tell comrades just how dangerous and manipulative and risky that problem is. Just like abortion, you ban abortion, you drive people into illegality and danger, and they're doing the same thing with trans kids. There were problems with the old Tavistock clinic, that's certainly true. There were 4-year waiting lists, they were under massive pressure, and they were grossly underfunded. Their record keeping was not so great. The length of time they could spend with each client was not perfect. They could do with seeing people more often. They could do with the sessions being longer. Cass could have called for a fully funded service to allow each child to spend more time with each clinician and to see them much sooner and more often, but no. But now, currently, there's a 5-year waiting list. There's staff recruitment problems in those centres which have tried to replace the Tavistock, and the service really has effectively ended. At the moment, there is no gender service for kids. I think in future years, we'll be able to look back and identify what you might call the cash generation. Those trans people who had to grow up without the possibility of medical help as teenagers. And of course, there will be those that never got the chance to grow up because of the viciousness of what this government is proposing under the soothing words of Hilary Cass. So to sum up, I think we need to campaign as socialists for more resources and better care for trans children and for better young people's mental health services in general. The fight for medical services for trans people, of course, has to be part of the wider fight for medical resources in general, for a regeneration of the National Health Service completely. And just as the fight against oppression of trans people is part of the fight for working class politics and socialism. Solidarity.